Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I'm here for my LPL Summer Playoffs Round 1 overview and analysis video. Incredibly excited to jump into this. We've got two series to cover in today's video, but it's officially playoff time here in the LPL. We've gone through the entirety of the regular season, didn't get a chance to cover the final week of the season because of just some unfortunate timing in terms of being away from the computer, but I did make a full playoff primer video that previewed every single team in the playoffs to give a full bracket prediction, and I did a full preview of these individual series that we're going to be covering in today's video. So if you're interested in checking that out, the link to that's going to be up in the iCard right now. You can go ahead and check that out before you come into this video. We've got a lot of interesting discussions in that, but today we get to go over the round 1 series that happened. We're going to find out the two teams that are firstly eliminated from the LPL playoffs, and I could not be more excited. And if you guys are excited as well, let me know down in the comment section below. Let me know who you guys thought was going to win both of these round 1 series. Of course, again, check out that primer video if you want to know my thoughts on these series and who I'm projecting to win, but no major upsets projected from me today. Certainly some intriguing matchups, though, and ones that I think are definitely bound to bring up some interesting games. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into it. If you're new here, what we do is we go game by game in each series, talking about the advantages and disadvantages that both teams were able to generate, just kind of giving an overview of what happened in the game. I'll give a player of the game, a dud of the game. At the end of each series, I'll give a player of the series, and then at the end of the video, we're going to preview the next round as well here in the LPL. So a lot of really good stuff coming up, but without further ado, let's go ahead and start talking about the first series of the LPL playoffs, and it was a battle between the number 8 seeded Edward Gaming and the number 9 seeded Team WE. Certainly an intriguing matchup, obviously. Two very historic organizations, EDG kind of being birthed from the ashes of WE, if you will, from some players who wanted to form their own sub-faction, if you will, in the LPL, and both of them have been incredibly successful in the history of the LPL, but both struggled at points here in the summer split, and so definitely an intriguing matchup. I think on paper, a lot of people are going to talk about EDG being pretty big favorites, but WE has been a team that has sneakily been pretty good all split long, especially players like Shanks and Hang, I think have been pretty solid. Hope and Awandi have had a couple of good games, and Cube, I think, has definitely been an upgrade on the top side, even if he's not in the best of form right now. But for EDG on the other side of the map, I do think that their talent is absurd, and if they can just get together some of their, issues playing together as a unit and their communication, especially towards the back half of the game, I think they're going to be just fine as a team. They're still going to be one of the more competitive, dangerous teams in the LPL, just like they were last split when a lot of people had them as a top 2 team. They ended up finishing 3rd, but still, I mean, 3rd, and now they're in the first round. It's certainly a place that they want to get back to, but they're going to have to go through WE to do that. Remember, no double elimination until we get to top 4, so losing today means you are out, and we get to kick it off here with game number 1, and the winner of game number 1 was Edward Gaming. They are able to take the first game of this series. They're able to go up 1-0, which is obviously a huge advantage. You want to be able to generate that confidence and that success early so that you can transition it into more parts of the later game, and this was a wild game number 1, a very back and forth game from both teams. Honestly, I think you can give a lot of credit to both teams, but WE is going to feel real hard done to not be able to take this game because they were in control for a lot of it. EDG being able to win it, it was mostly a comeback attempt, and that's really impressive, I would say, overall from them. There were a lot of good moments in this game, I would say, for both teams, but WE controlling the early and mostly the mid game, I think was really impressive to me, and this is really like one of their strengths, I would say, when you look at them as a unit. Hang and Shanks, in particular, as a jungle mid duo, are very good at being able to corral tempo in the early to mid game. They do a very good job of being able to make sure that their side of the map is winning, and I absolutely think that that happened here in this game. They dominated the top side. They really tried to get Ale super far behind onto that Jax, and they got quite a bit of gold onto the Azir, which was going to be really important for a lot of these late game team fights. When you look at these two comps, when you look at, the Jax and the Jace and the Xayah going up against, Azir and Jinx and Cassante, which one of these two do you think would be able to win late game team fights a little bit more efficiently? If you guessed the team with Jace and Xayah and Rakan and all that, and Jax, like, you're insane. I can't believe you guessed that, but you're right. Kind of insane how that ended up working out, but credit to EDG for being able to keep their head in the game and be able to walk out of this with a win. My player of the game is going to go to Uzi in the bot lane. He was clearly the best player in this game, and That was a big question mark, I would say, going into the series. Not that Uzi was bad, but, Uzi's team fighting, I think, has certainly been questionable. Not in terms of positioning, but in terms of communication. Not always getting the kind of peel that he needs. Sometimes he's stepping up a little bit further than I think what EDG is expecting. He certainly doesn't play like what Leave was playing like before Uzi got into this lineup, and so I think there are a lot of question marks about whether or not that's going to be sustainable, but this was actually a really confidence-building win for me in terms of what they were able to do and how they were able to do it. I think Mako in particular also played really well in this game towards the back half on the recon. A lot of really great engages and a lot of really, really good setups for Uzi to be able to capitalize on. Those two, like I've said a lot of times over the course of this split up until this point, have just not been on the same page, and so to see them on the same page in this game, it's definitely a positive and it's definitely impressive. The Ivern coming out for Jeje, very important as well. This pick is absolutely broken right now. It is insane just how strong it is. I would expect to be pick or ban in a lot of series throughout the LPL playoffs and basically in every other region as well, and Jeje, I think, piloted it very well in this one, being able to get it on blue side on second rotation, which is actually insane. So those three players, I think, were the main positive culprits. I think Fofo also had some good moments on the Jace. It just wasn't really a game that was entirely about him. It was more so about bot lane on the side of EDG, both in the early and in the late game. But a lot of pressure being thrown topside by WE, and Ale was kind of, unfortunately, the recipient of that. I was very close to giving him dud of the game because I don't think he was particularly good on the Jackson this one. I think there were a lot of moments where he was just too aggressive, but also I want to cut him some slack because WE did put a lot of resources into getting him into that position where he was a little bit further behind, and so there's going to be a lot of people, I think, that say that Ale was a big hindrance for EDG, and I can understand why this game, but I think WE had a very clear game plan, and Ale was definitely the target of that. He was able to come out on the other side, not lose too hard, and allow the rest of his team to be able to win, and that's really all that matters in the end. But like I said, for WE, gotta be frustrated. You've got to be upset that you weren't able to take this one. I mean, you had such a lead in this game, and to throw that away towards the back half, it's just disappointing. You had so much gold on Shanks. Cube was in a really good position. Hang was actually playing relatively well in the early game, and things just kind of fell apart. There really wasn't a lot that they could do when they started getting out team fought towards the back half of the game. They just weren't as good as EDG. There really is no other way to put it. My dud of the game is going to go to Hang in the jungle. I think that there were a lot more, there was a lot of situations where I thought a better Sejuani would be able to do a lot more in this game, and I think that really just comes back to Hang, right? He's a good player, especially for a rookie. I think he's done a lot of really good things over the course of this year, but I do think that his inconsistencies towards the back half of games and his inability to really be a consistent team fighter on these more tanky style engaged champions is a problem for him, and it's a problem for WE because they really need that. They really rely on that, and so overall, it's going to be really important for Heng to be able to try and clean that up. It's going to be interesting to see if he's going to be able to do it throughout the rest of this series, but you wanted to see more from Hope and Awandi. I think that they were relied upon a ton, on some comfort picks for them to be able to, beat Uzi and Mako, or at the very least stay even with them, and they were not able to stay even in damage. Hope was not nearly as impressive as Uzi towards the back half of this game, and Awandi on his signature Janna, the thing that he basically one-tricked his way up into pro, it just wasn't very good, and so definitely some question marks, but WE at the very least showed that they can hang with EDG in the early game. If they can just get a little bit more clinical in terms of executing towards the back half of the game, I think that they're actually in a relatively decent position here to be able to take a couple more games. But for EDG, now you've only got to win 2 instead of 3. This is a really nice win to get, considering you were on the back foot for a lot of this. It might not be the most dominant one of all time, but it's certainly a nice one to have. But are they going to be able to repeat it in game 2, or is WE going to bounce back and say, most of this game was ours, and we're going to prove that by tying the series up? Well, we're going to find out now, because the winner of game number 2 was Team WE, and this is another one where it is just, how did they win this game? How is it possible that they won this game? This is basically the exact opposite of game number 1, where we were talking about, WE having full control for most of this and then kind of throwing it away towards the back half to allow EDG another opportunity to get back into the game. WE won this game at a gold deficit. Like, that's how insane this was. They had 2 less towers taken on their side than EDG did, and they still were able to win the game. Just really crazy stuff, a really wild and quick finish, considering the state that the game was in, but, I mean, that's WE. Sometimes you get a really good performance out of your mid laner, and, you're able to steamroll a fight, and you're able to just take the game, basically instantly, so really good stuff coming in from WE. Really happy to see them be able to tie up the series, but it's anyone's game at this point. Being able to take that second game and not go down 0-2, that's a series saver. You don't want to have to win 3 games in a row against a team like EDG, and this just puts you in a much better position to play a best of 3, which is winnable for a team like WE. But let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the game for me, pretty obviously going to go to Shanks in the mid lane. Phenomenal game coming in from him. He wasn't the only one who played terrific. I think that there were a lot of players on WE that played really well, especially towards the back half of that game, you know, in the pivotal final fights, but it's really Shanks, like, that you're going to talk about, and he's been the guy for WE basically throughout the whole year. I know a lot of, you know, attention and positivity has gone on to Hang. There's a lot of positive attention on players like Hope and Awandi, and Cube has certainly been an upgrade. People are talking about them, but Shanks is the best player on this team, and he has been in 2023, and I don't even think it's all that up for debate, right? He was so good towards the beginning part of the summer split. People started to forget about that because, you know, he didn't exactly live up to that expectation moving into the second half of the summer split, but he's still an incredibly talented player, and I think he did a really good job on the Tristana this game. If you give him something that he can snowball the game on, he's going to be able to do that, even from a relatively disadvantageous position. He was the better mid laner in this game, and I think you could argue he was the better mid laner in game number 1 as well, and so really good stuff coming in from Shanks. He's showing a very big superiority over a player in Fofo that I know the community is very down on, but I'm pretty high on. I think he's a really good player, a very consistent player, and Shanks has honestly been right up there with him, if not better than him, across the first 2 games of the series. Hang was also much better in this game. I think he did a much better job of team fighting on the Poppy than he did on the Sejuani, and that was something I was genuinely concerned about. It really did feel like if WE did not get an advantage in the early game out of their jungle position, that they just didn't really have a lot of avenues or opportunities to be able to pull the game back, but I think Hang did a really good job here, and to see WE be able to kind of capitalize on some late game, you know, errors coming in from a team that is prone to some late game errors, it's a really good thing overall, and definitely a positive. I think, you know, Hope was good towards the back half of the game. Awandi had a couple of engages on the recon. Cube was a little bit more questionable. I thought Ale had a much better game number 2, certainly a bounce back game number 2, but was still more than fine. This was a team effort from WE, but it's all spearheaded by Shanks in the mid lane and by that Tristana, which really has been such a massive pick and such a massive champion for this team. And then for EDG on the other side, you gotta be frustrated. You really should be up 2-0. Honestly, the series probably should be 1-1, but you probably should have lost game 1 and won game 2. That's really how this probably should have gone. Both of these games were kind of throws by the team in the lead towards the back half, and EDG definitely kind of the culprit of that. They were up a ridiculous amount in this game. They had so much pressure on top side. Ale on the Fiora was ridiculously strong, and there really wasn't anybody that was going to be able to contest him in the 1v1. Uzi had quite a bit of gold, but really just wasn't able to do anything with it. I know a lot of people are going to criticize Fofo, and he is going to get my dud of the game here because I do think he was probably the least impactful, but he did the most damage on his team, and he certainly was the most active. It's just, you know, it's LeBlanc. He's going to be able to do that. You want to see a little bit more activity out of him, and honestly, he's been a little bit less proactive than he has been over the course of the regular season towards the beginning part of this game, or the beginning part of this series, I should say, but, you know, taking all the pressure off of Uzi, who did like 10, 11,000 damage in this game, which is not good. Like, that's not particularly positive. And then Jeja on the Sejuani was relatively fine, but certainly wasn't creating a lot of opportunities for the rest of the team. Mako was actually fine on the Nautilus. I certainly don't think it was his fault, but I think there's a lot of blame to go around on this team. I don't think that you lose, you know, a 6 or 7k gold lead or whatever they had in this game accidentally, right? You don't lose a game where you're up in gold even after the Nexus is taken on accident. Everybody has to make some mistakes towards the back half of that. You got to get your carry blown up. You got to not be able to deal damage. You got to not be able to peel for your backline. A lot of things have to go wrong, and I think almost all of them did for EDG. And so you're hoping that it doesn't take too big of a toll on their mental, but I really don't like the way that they played this game, and I'm very concerned with what happened. You got to be able to put it behind you, though. Both of these teams have now shown the ability to generate early leads and then throw them away, and both, I guess, have shown the ability to be able to come back from pretty large deficits, and so it's going to be interesting. The series is now tied up at 1-1. It becomes a regular season best of 3 at this point. You just got to win 2 of the final 3 in order to move on to the next round, and so game 3 is going to be very important in order to generate any sort of momentum on this series. But who's going to be able to take it? Who's going to be able to take full control over this series? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Edward Gaming. They are able to take game number 3. They're able to move up into this series 2-1, which is oh so important, as we've talked about up until this point already. And, you know, you've got to be happy for this team. There's been a lot of communication issues, but this game was the first of the series, really, in game number 3 to actually be clean and to actually be efficient for many of these players. And, you know, a couple of these players I think have really stepped up this series. Certainly some better performances than maybe people have been giving them credit for. And I think EDG in particular in this one was basically just good across the board. We can talk about a lot of the advantages. A couple of things that WE did to try and stay in the game, but they they really weren't all that successful. EDG was just simply the better team in this one. My player of the game is going to go to Ale in the top lane. Really good performance from him on the Jax. He was also very good on that Fiora in game number 2, even if he did struggle a bit in game number 1, but this is the Ale that we wanted to see. He was the best top laner in the LPL in spring, and I don't even think that that's like a crazy controversial take to say. He was so good just a couple of months ago, but he really has not carried that level of momentum into the summer split. He's not been nearly as dominant, in my opinion. He's still been very good in lane, but his impact, outside of the laning phase and his ability to transition that either into split push pressure, dueling pressure, whatever you want to call it, or team fight pressure, really just has not been there. He's not necessarily been that same huge positive factor that he was for a lot of the spring split, but in this series so far, he's been majorly impactful in the last 2 games, even if that first one really wasn't the greatest in the entire world. Really like what he was able to do on the Jax. And I hope he's going to be able to keep this up. When this team has a very good top laner, they're so much more difficult to beat because they invest so much into that bot lane. They really try to make sure that Uzi is in a good spot to be able to carry. So when top lane wins or when mid lane wins, like they gain so much pressure on the map to be able to just kind of transition a lot of their advantages into the mid to late game. And I think that that's what Ale really was able to do in this game number 3. I think Jeje also deserves a massive shout out for the Ivern. Led the game in kill participation. Not particularly surprising because of just how strong Ivern is as a champion right now. And we know that Jeje is very fond of that champion. Maybe fond is the wrong term. He's very aware of how strong that champion is at the current moment. We've seen him complain about it in the past, but if you can't beat him, join him. You might as well pick it up. It's an incredibly good pick at the moment, and he really did make use of it. I think Mako was phenomenal. He's honestly been very good across this series up until this point. I think Uzi's going to get a lot of the credit for being able to capitalize on it, but Mako's been great so far for EDG across all 3 of these games. A couple of these Nautilus engages were fantastic. Going deathless on Nautilus while actually still being able to make a lot of plays is not an easy task to have. And I think realistically, you could absolutely give him player of the game for game number 3 for how good he was. Fofo was really good on Jace. I would argue that this is his best champion. I know people have criticized him for not being able to play it in the past, but I don't think those people have watched him play Jace because he's really good at this champion. He has been for a lot of 2023. It's certainly been the most consistent pick that EDG can bring out. And then Uzi, ironically enough, was probably the player I noticed the least throughout this game, but that's a good thing because Uzi's going to be fine. I don't really think he's going to be the one to make a lot of mistakes. And so if Ale, Fofo, Mako, Jeje, if all of them are stepping up and being able to deal a lot of damage and Uzi can take more of a secondary carry role, I think that's a really good sweet spot for EDG, and I think that that was a really good case here in game number 3. So good win for them. Bad loss for WE. This is kind of a confidence breaker, if you will, because he kind of got steamrolled. He kind of got run over. Really not a lot of positives to talk about for this team. I still think Shanks is doing really well for them, this time on the Azir. Still able to create a lot of pressure, and he's a really good team fighter. Can be a little bit inconsistent towards that part of the game, but is really good in the early game to the point where he's often going into the team fights with a lot of gold and with some leads that he can translate. But the rest of this team is just not catching up. Like, they're just not able to keep up with him in terms of the pace that they need to be on in order for this team to be able to beat a team like Edward Gaming. My dud of the game is going to go to Cube in the top lane. Like I said, top gap was pretty apparent this one. The Cassante was just not useful at all. Cube has not been very good on this pick. He wasn't very good on it on Rare Atom in spring, and he's not been very good on it for WE in summer. This has probably been his worst top laner, so it's very interesting that they continue to go to this over and over again. Again, I understand that. Cassante is a very strong pick. He basically gives you everything that you could possibly want out of a top laner, but if it's not working, it's not working, and you got to be able to abandon it at some point. But the bot lane losing as hard as they did was a major issue. Hope has just not really been up to the standard this series, and I think it's just really coming to show what Hope is as a player. He's a good, not great player, right? He's someone who, when he goes into Uzi and Mako, especially when Mako is playing well, he's not going to be able to hold up to that kind of bot lane. He's a scaler. He's certainly not going to be able to hold up in laning phase, which has been a major problem for him, not only in this game, but in this entire series. Iwandi's been relatively irrelevant. He's just been relatively okay, right? Couple of mistakes, couple of positioning errors, but for the most part, it's just kind of been there. The bot lane has not been good for WE, and Hang was not very good on Sejuani. The consistency with which Hang misses Sejuani ults towards the back half of games is actually astounding. He's just not good at this champion. Another thing that I just would not pick for WE. Like, I think this draft kind of goes against a lot of the advantages that they're able to generate. I think Shanks on a team fighter instead of something that can create early, Hope on something that can scale is good, but, the Cassante, the Sejuani, these are not the things that I want to see from WE because they're just simply not working at the moment, and now it's do or die. They're one game away from their entire season being done, and that means you got to pull out the things that you are most comfortable with. It's going to be interesting to see what they end up going towards, but hasn't exactly worked out up until this point. point. But for EDG, really nice win to be able to take control of this series, and you are one game away from now being able to move on to round 2, which at the very least has to be your goal in these playoffs. So big game for both teams. Can EDG close it out, or is WE going to take us to a game number 5? Well, the winner of game number 4 was Edward Gaming. They are able to take game number 4. They're able to take the series 3-1, and they're going to be moving on to the second round of the LPL playoffs, keeping their regional qualifier hopes alive. They really don't have to do all that much in order to get to that spot. A win in this series was a very good step in that direction. It doesn't absolutely guarantee anything because there are so many teams that could theoretically jump above them in terms of championship points, just if they go on some miracle playoff runs that are still left alive. But a lot of the top teams this split were the top teams last split, so this team looking pretty in a pretty good spot, I should say, moving into the regional qualifier, being able to pick up this win, especially if they're going to be able to get another. But we'll talk about that later. Let's talk about game number 4 here and what exactly happened. We talked about game number 3 being relatively not close and kind of being the biggest blowout of the series. I would still agree that game 3 is the biggest blowout, but EDG definitely still had control of game number 4 as well. They were just kind of the better team towards the back half of the series after some very interesting games in games 1 and 2, although WE definitely tried to put up a fight in this one. There were definitely some moments where I think they looked relatively okay. They went for a much more aggressive comp, something like the Nocturne Annie, to be able to set things up, even things like the Blitzcrank to be able to create, and a very strong pick in the meta right now in Kaisa being left up on the board for them on blue side to kind of give them some opportunities. The problem is that EDG actually has a really good comp to go into a lot of this, super burst. I think things like the Ivern, things like the Xayah, things like the Ornn are really good at being able to disengage what Nocturne Annie wants to do as a duo, and that was very difficult for WE to try and overcome, but credit to EDG, they still had to be able to capitalize on a lot of these team fights, and I think they absolutely did. Player of the game is pretty easily going to go to Fofo in the mid lane. Phenomenal performance coming in from him on the Tristana, and again, I think performances like this end up going super under the radar for Fofo over the course of his LPL time. He's been very good. He's had more performances like this than you would think from a player that gets as much hate as he does online. I think he's actually been a really big positive for EDG. Maybe not every single game, but in most games, he's a positive for the team, and I think this was kind of an example of that. I think he's just generally a pretty good mid laner. I would say maybe not like in that tier of the best mid laners in the LPL, but I would say he's in the tier right below that. He's a top, 5, 6, 7 mid laner in the LPL, and I think that's more than good enough to be able to win with this team, where some of these players throughout this split have not looked like top 5, 6, or 7 players in their roles. And so good stuff from Fofo. Ole continues to just have a phenomenal series, and actually, for the series as a whole, he's actually going to get my player of the series. Maybe not player of the game here, but player of the series. I think he was the most consistent player for EDG across, all 4 games, and he just really was phenomenal. And if Ole's going to step up and be as good as he was here, it's going to be very difficult for EDG to go down, even against some of the good teams. We'll get into their matchup in round 2, at the end of this video, but really good stuff from Ole. And especially on Ornn, for him to be able to create so much and be as aggressive as he was and be able to punish the Renekton as much as he did, it's just really impressive stuff. You want to see him be able to play like this consistently, and his ability to be able to do it here, I think, was very impressive. Jeje had a phenomenal series on Ivern. That champion is so ridiculously strong, and I think he did pilot it well. It's crazy that he got 3 wins on that champion, but it's kind of just how it is at the current moment, and so I would expect it to be more pick or ban as we go along in the LPL playoffs, probably more ban, but as we saw in this series, maybe WE just didn't have the same kind of fear into it as a lot of other teams do, and so they left it up for 3 games, and they got punished 3 games because of it. So crazy stuff there. Uzi was still relatively good. Again, not really the focal point of the game, but was dealing a lot of damage on the Xayah, and Mako was phenomenal throughout this entire series. Honestly, everybody on EDG, especially towards the back half, looked really good. I think Ale was the most consistent, but Jeje, Mako, I think are definitely kind of the standouts for what EDG was able to do across all 4 games. Good stuff from them. And then for WE, unfortunately, this is how your season comes to an end. They do not have enough championship points to qualify for the season finals, the regional qualifiers, and so their season is done, and it's an unfortunate way to go, but it's so much better than anything you were able to do in 2022, and with that kind of context, I think it is a little bit more excusable. Remember, this team went 0-16 in summer of last year, and so for them to be able to make playoffs in both of the splits this season, I think is definitely something that they're going to to be pretty excited about. Dud of the game for me, unfortunately, though, in game number 4 is going to go to that Nocturne. It's going to go to Hang. Nocturne just isn't going to be able to do a whole ton in this game. As long as EDG is in a position where they're relatively safe in how they want to play, like the Tristana's never really going to be in that much danger because she can jump out of the fear. The Xayah's never going to be in that much danger because she can ult out of the fear, and you don't really want to go on any of the other targets, potentially the Ivern, but he can just shield himself, and Daisy's actually a big problem for Nocturne to be able to deal with, and so really not a lot of good targets this game. I still think Hang is an interesting player, but I think when we saw him go into a team that actually does have a lot of mechanical skill and can play the early game relatively efficiently, there just wasn't a lot of ways for him to continuously be able to win. I still think Shanks was the best player in this game. I know the scoreline doesn't necessarily indicate that, but a lot of really good engages, a lot of really good ultimates to try and set up the rest of his team, and I think Hope and Cube did their jobs to try and capitalize on that. They just didn't have enough firepower, but again, I don't want to see Shanks on a stun butt. I want to see him on something more aggressive. I think he's going to walk out of 2023 with his stock raised quite a bit. It's going to be interesting to see if WE can retain him, because I think he's going to be a pretty hot commodity amongst a lot of the top teams in the LPL, but it'll be interesting to see what happens there. Cube was relatively inefficient this series, but was relatively fine here in game number 4. Hope probably had his best game of the series on the super broken Kai'Sa, just wasn't really able to capitalize enough, and Awandi did the best he could on the Blitzcrank, but who are you going to hook on this team? You're never going to be in range to hook the Tristana or the Xayah, and so you're hooking probably Ornn or Alistair, and that's just a positive, I would say, overall for EDG. So not exactly the best game to play that champion into, but, you know, WE, I think when you're looking at their season as a whole, you got to think of it relatively positively just because of the context surrounding the situation. I think this is about where we all kind of expected them to land. A top 9, top 10 team in the LPL by the end of the year. Maybe some people thought that they could be a little bit better, maybe win a round 1 series, but with the amount of talent that has kind of emerged in the LPL over the course of this split, I think WE is going to be relatively fine with the outcome that they have here. But for EDG, congratulations on moving on to round 2. They're going to be facing OMG in that second round, which is certainly not an easy opponent, but we'll preview that at the end, at least for now. Congratulations to this team, and I think it's going to be really important that they collected these 10 championship points moving into the future. But with our first series now done and in the dust, we can move on to our second series of round number 1 here in the LPL, and this was another very intriguing matchup. We saw the battle between the number 7-seeded Royal Never Give Up and the number 10-seeded Ninjas in Pyjamas. Both of these teams coming into the playoffs not exactly in the best form possible. RNG at certain points throughout this split has looked relatively convincing, but I argued in my preview video that this was going to be the closer of the 2 round 1 series. We're going to be interested to see if that ends up panning out, but really do like both of these teams for different reasons. I think RNG's top side is just really good. Breathe has been very underratedly fantastic throughout this split. I think he's been an all-pro caliber top laner. I ended up making him my 3rd team all-pro over 369, which I think is going to make some people mad, but haven't gotten any crazy comments about it in that section anyways, but I think Breathe has been really, really good. I think he's been the best player on RNG throughout this split up until this point, and I don't think he gets the credit for it. I think Wei gets a lot of the credit for that, but actually I think Wei's been a little bit less consistent than maybe he was in spring. I actually really liked his spring split. He was the big player that was kind of dragging that team across the finish line into playoffs, even with, you know, some of the better players on the team. Gala obviously helped him out a lot, and I would say Gala was just as good, but Wei was pretty fantastic in this spring split. I don't think he got a ton of credit. Now I think he's getting too much credit for how good he has been for this team. I think Tongyuan and LP have actually been relatively serviceable, and Wei has had moments that he's been relatively bad, even though you see everybody on Reddit talking about him as like an MVP candidate because he's on a team where he's the most established player. It's just kind of how it goes when it comes to player perception. But where I think Ninjas in Pyjamas can generate a lot of their leads is their mid-jungle duo, which I really see as a major positive. I think Shadow and Angel have worked off of each other incredibly well, and I think both of them have been really big positives over the course of this entire split. I talked about that in my preview section, where I said if they're going to do well in this series, it's going to probably be through that jungle mid duo, with Angel stepping up and being a primary carry, or Shadow just straight up being better than Wei, which I think he was over the course of the regular season. Photic obviously is a really talented player, but has had a really bad summer split, if we're being honest. Zhuo's okay, but certainly not a superstar, and Invincible can be feast or famine, right? He can have really good games, he can have really bad games, and so it's really going to be up to the form of NIP to see what they're going to be able to do against RNG, a team that I think does rely a little bit more on their consistency. But of course, that's all just the preview. It's time to find out what actually happened in the game, starting of course with game number 1. And the winner of game number 1 was Ninjas in Pyjamas, they are able to take the first game in the series, which I think is going to surprise quite a few people, but I'm not entirely shocked. Again, I thought this was going to be the closer of the two first-round series, and NIP being able to step in and actually go against RNG is a really, really good sign overall for me. This was a really good game number one. You know, it looks pretty dominant, a 29-minute win, 11-4, you know, a good gold lead, but RNG definitely did a lot more to hang around in this game than I think the stats give them credit for. I think that there were a couple of good plays coming in from Tongyuan, a couple of good plays from Breathe that I think kept this game and this series relatively close, but NIP was better throughout most of it. They were able to generate a lead in the early game, and even if they did hiccup a bit in the mid game, they were able to regather in the late game, be able to win the fights that they needed to, and move on into being able to take a 1-0 lead in this series, which is obviously oh so important. My player of the game is going to go to Shadow in the jungle. I think this is very variable. I think you can very realistically give this to Invincible in the top lane on that Kennen, who just was doing a ridiculous amount of damage. RNG was prioritizing him first in every single team fight, and it almost didn't matter because the Kennen really was that big of a deal to try and deal with. This was a very good performance coming out of the top lane, but Shadow to me was really the one that stood out. The engages coming in from the Poppy and the ability to shut down a lot of what RNG wants to do. You look at this comp and it's actually very, very weak to Poppy. The Rel and the Vi double engage is very weak to Poppy, really not able to get in on that champion and do all that much, and then really cuts off the escapability and the flexibility of things like the Ahri and the Fiora if you are in a position to actually try and deal with them. Most specifically the Fiora, but Ahri can be a little bit affected as well. And so really, really nice pick coming in here from Ninjas in Pyjamas on R3. Really like what they were able to do to kind of negate a lot of the engage threats on the side of RNG, and I think Shadow played it at a very high level. He's been this team's best player probably over the course of this split. I think Angel definitely has an argument to be made in that conversation as well, but Shadow really has been fantastic, and it is really good to see him be able to step up and be, you know, the best player on a playoff team in the LPL. I think a lot of people were questioning whether or not he was going to be able to do that when he was on LGD for so many years and just not winning, but it goes to show that he was actually elo trapped, and he's been very good for this NIP team. Like I said, Invincible also was really good in this game. He's so much damage on the Kennen. If he was a little bit more careful with some of his engages, he would have easily been player of the game for me, but just was a little bit over-eager at times, and that's what Invincible can do. He's really good in lane phase, but can be a little bit over-eager in team fights to kind of make a big play, and a lot of the big plays were positives for NIP in this one, but it doesn't necessarily excuse the fact that some of them were also poor. I thought Angel was good on the Nico, Photic was dealing a lot of damage on the Kai'Sa, but Zhuo was also really good in this game on the Rakan. We're going to get to the rest of the games in this series, but I think this was one of his better ones in quite a long time, and really this is the kind of performance that he shows sometimes. We've seen the really good flashes from Zhuo over the course of this year, most notably in spring. There were quite a few. Hasn't been quite as explosive, I would say, in summer. I think the bot lane in general has just gotten less resources because the other side of the map has honestly gotten better over the course of this year, but I think Zhuo in general is still a fine player. Not a superstar, but this was a good performance. Overall, NIP looked good, and RNG kind of looked bad. This was a team that didn't look all that coordinated, and most specifically, their bot lane looked completely outclassed. There really was no pressure coming in from that side of the map. Dead of the game could go to absolutely either of them, either LP or Lumao. I think both had pretty bad games, and honestly, both have been really bad over the past couple of weeks. I think LP has had moments where he's looked good, especially towards the back half of games in team fights if he can survive the early laning phase, and he was able to do quite a bit of damage in this game, but it was at the cost of just having no pressure on the map. He was dying so quickly, and so in these team fights, even though he was able to get out some damage, it wasn't enough to really justify the fact that he wasn't able to stay alive for longer than 2 seconds, and that's what's going to happen when you go into Kennen, when you go into Nico, when you go into Rakan. Like a lot of these divers, even the Kai'Sa, right? There's so many things that can get on top of this Aphelios and make RNG's life much more difficult in the team fighting phase, and I think they executed on that well, but LP is going to get done of the game because of it. He wasn't particularly good in this one. Lumao really didn't do anything on the Rel. That's a champion that I think is relatively strong right now, and, you know, kind of difficult to play into this comp, which is why he's not getting done of the game, but, you know, just something to keep in mind. I think Tongyuan tried to create some plays on the Ahri Wei, and Breathe also tried to create some plays throughout this game, but for the most part, they were also relatively inactive, and when you look at the plays that Invincible, Shadow, and Angel were able to create as a trio in comparison to what Breathe, Wei, and Tongyuan were able to create, it's not even really all that close, and so RNG just kind of looking outclassed in this first game. If LP and Lumao are going to be, like, significantly worse in the bot lane, and if Shadow and Angel are going to continue to step up, this could be a very NIP favored series. That is a very clear path to victory for NIP, and I think that they showed that in game number 1. Now, for RNG, can you expect them to be able to perform like this in every single game of this series? Probably not. They're probably better than this, right? Or at least you would have to hope that they're going to be better than this as we move throughout the series, but this is certainly a concerning start, and not really what you were looking for. But is RNG going to be able to bounce back and tie the series up at 1 apiece, or is NIP going to put themselves in a pretty fantastic position by taking a 2-0 series lead here? Well, we're going to find out in game number 2, and the winner of game number 2 was Ninjas in Pyjamas. They are able to take game number 2. They were able to go up in the series 2-0, which is massive. I know a lot of people weren't expecting this, but really, really good stuff from NIP, and honestly, like, I know a lot of people are going to be surprised. I'm not entirely surprised. I did pick RNG to win this series. I thought that they would have enough firepower to be able to overcome them, but I see the avenues, and honestly, I see the things that are falling apart for RNG at the current moment that are causing them to have some trouble. Now, the series is not over yet. Just 2-0 is a pretty big deficit. You've now got to win 3 games in a row against a team that has just beaten you twice, and also took the regular season series as well. And so a lot in favor of NIP. And what did they do to get there? Well, they just kind of outplayed them. Like, there were some moments where RNG looked good in this series, or in this game, I should say, but it really wasn't, like, sustainable, right? RNG actually had a gold lead for a lot of this game, and it never really felt like that. Wei was playing really well on the Maokai. He built full AP on that champion, and he was doing a ridiculous amount of damage with saplings just so consistently before a lot of these contests. But outside of that, they really didn't have all that much damage. LP was, again, almost entirely irrelevant in this game, and Tong Yuan, while he was dealing a lot of poke, it wasn't really sustained damage, and you don't really need Jace to be your primary damage dealer. It really did come down to the fact that the Aphelios really wasn't doing all that much, and you had no real consistent way to engage once you were to set up a lot of those traps. But NIP just capitalizing on a lot of that and being able to take advantage of late game team fighting and putting themselves in a position where they can capitalize on their comp's strengths. And man, did they capitalize. Player of the game for me is going to go to Photic in the bot lane. Really good stuff from him on the Kai'Sa. We know this pick is really strong right now, but you do have to play it rather aggressive and rather well to be able to pull it off at the same level that a lot of the other, players in the world are doing it now. AP Kai'Sa not necessarily as much, can just kind of do the same thing that Jace does, but with significantly more damage. But Photic, I think, still was dealing so much damage this game. He was such a big factor that RNG had to deal with that he's an easy choice for player of the game. This is one of his better performances in a while. I've been very low on Photic over the course of not only this year, but his entire career. Anybody who follows the channel knows that. I think his mechanical skill is a little bit overrated, although I do think he's still very good. I just think the consistency is absolutely not there, and he's kind of been a little bit of a problem for this team when he isn't playing well. Luckily for them, that is not today. He's actually been really good going into a player in LP that he is just better than, and so that's really, really good to see. You need to be able to capitalize on the matchups where you do get a bot lane that isn't going to be quite as strong as you are, and I think Photic did that in this one. Really good game from him. Zhuo was also pretty solid on the Alistar to be able to set things up, but I want to give a big shout out to Shadow again in the jungle for being able to take that rel. We've seen this flexed into the jungle a little bit over the course of this split, but honestly, things like the Rel jungle and the Nautilus jungle, things like that, it's not really been all that successful. We've seen the best players in the world be able to pilot it, but I do think you kind of have to be the better player in order to make things like Rel especially work. You have to be so aggressive and your pathing has to be so clear, clean, that I don't think you can pull this off if you're just like an average player. And that's how I know Shadow's really good, right? Shadow's been really good over the course of this whole split, and this was a really good game on Rel. Invincible not dying on Renekton. Angel putting out a lot of damage on the Tristana, even if he wasn't the focal point. Just a good game for NIP. Not really a lot to complain about, and certainly not a lot to criticize. And then for RNG on the other side, you're starting to get worried. You are one game away from having your season end. Remember, it's not just, losing in the playoffs. This team would not be going to Worlds if they lost this series, guaranteed. They're already kind of a heavy underdog to go to Worlds in the first place, but this is an RNG team that doesn't miss Worlds very often. They missed it in 2020, and I can't even remember the last time before that they ended up missing it. This team has been to Worlds so many different times out of the LPL that it's at least worth noting that losing here in the first round would be a massive disappointment for this organization, but this Game 2 loss was not great. Out of the game, pretty easily going to go to Lumao. This bot lane has just been completely outclassed. You can, kind of throw LP into there as well. Neither of them have been good at basically any point across these first two games. They've both been complete afterthoughts. Lumao was much worse in this game number 2. I think LP was much worse in that game number 1, and so just things to consider, but man, if you're going to play this bad, we'll get into it. You can't really be in the lineup, and that's kind of what is going to happen. You know, we'll see it when we get into game number 3. There is going to be a substitution, but Lumao's just regressed so much as this split has gone on. I was defending him for a lot of this split, and I still kind of am, because I see a lot of people saying he's like a bottom 1 support in the league, and I just don't agree with that. I think Lumao still has good games, but it's clear that he can't go up against a team that has good communication and actually survive, and I think a lot of that has been confidence in recent weeks. I actually thought he was relatively good at the beginning of summer split, but the last 3 or so weeks have just been miserable for him, and I think it's definitely taken a toll on his gameplay, and so pretty easy choice for dead of the game, but like I said, LP was also really bad. Breathe didn't really do anything on the Gnar, and then Tong Yuan was dealing damage on the Jace, but it wasn't really like effective damage, it was just kind of there. Wei was really the only player in this game that I would consider to be relatively good, and this is kind of the performance that RNG fans talk about, where it's Wei and then a bunch of wards. This is one of the few times this year where that has actually kind of been a true statement. I think Wei was actually pretty good, but RNG just doesn't feel like they have enough firepower to be able to get over this wall. Shadow's playing really well. Photic and Zhuo are the better bot lane, and that bodes really well for Ninjas in Pyjamas. Even with a player like Angel not necessarily being a focal point like he has been all year, this team feels really strong right now, and they have an opportunity to close out this series in a clean sweep in game number 3. Are they going to be able to do it, or is RNG going to, at the very least, keep their season alive for one more game? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Royal Never Give Up. They are able to take game 3. They're able to keep this series alive here, and I don't think a lot of people saw that coming. I think a lot of people expected them to just kind of die after game number 2. I know I sure did when I was watching this series. I was like, all right, well, they've lost 2 in a row, and NIP really feels like they're on a roll right now. It feels like draft was very much in favor of NIP, but, you know, some confidence-boosting substitutions coming in from RNG, only one really. It's Lele coming back in to play support here. That means that Lumao is on the bench, and this is probably justified. I don't think Lele is a particularly great player, but Lumao has been very bad, and so whatever direction you want to go, if you feel like Lele gives you a better chance to win at the current moment, you don't have a tomorrow if you don't win today, so you might as well give it a shot, and you know what? It absolutely worked here in game 3. I don't think Lele was the reason, although I think he had a couple of good engages. I think mostly when you're looking at this game, it's again, top side of the map for RNG. Bot lane continuing to be more of a wagon than they are the thing pulling the wagon, and I think at this point, that's just kind of what you're going to get with RNG, but topside can win you games, and they did win this one. Player of the game for me was actually really, really tough, because there's 2 very deserving candidates in a game that honestly was kind of a blowout. RNG was definitely better in this one, but I'm going to give it to Breathe on the K'Sante. I thought he really was fantastic. I feel really bad for not being able to give it to Tong Yuan, because I think Tong Yuan was still really, really good on the Jace. There were still a lot of really good things to say about his performance, and we'll get to him in a second, but Breathe, in my opinion, just continues to be the thing that pulls this team across the finish line. We can talk about Wei. We can talk about Tong Yuan being relatively good players. Tong Yuan obviously winning Rookie of the Split here. I didn't give it to him, but I can understand why, you know, they give it to him. He's probably the most successful rookie in terms of wins. But Breathe in this game really did show why I considered him an all-pro caliber player. When he's able to teamfight on that K'Sante, he's able to do so much. This champion does not feel particularly balanced when in the hands of some of the best top laners in the world, and that's really what you have to consider Breathe. It's what he has been for quite a long time. This was just a really good performance both in and out of lane. Was good at basically every part of the game. Great laning phase, great team fighting, was able to basically shut off a lot of the carries that Ninjas in Pyjamas really wanted to field. You know, the Tristana, the Ziggs, it's a lot more difficult to actually deal with them with the K'Sante because he can take out the Poppy. He can remove the Poppy from the fight, and, you know, that really opens up the door for Rakan and Varus and Maokai to be able to try and get onto the backline, and so really, really good stuff coming in from Breathe. Really like the K'Sante pick for him in general. It's obviously incredibly broken, but we've seen in the past what LPL players are comfortable and what LPL players aren't comfortable on the pick, and Breathe is definitely one of the players that I would definitely consider comfortable on the pick, as we saw in this game. And then Tong Yuan is obviously the other player. The amount of damage that he's able to do on Jace is actually ridiculous. That champion can be a huge problem at times, and, you know, I think that he's probably the best, maybe the second best mid laner in the game right now, behind Tristana, who I think is also really strong, and we'll talk about that on the other side, but Tong Yuan just piloted it better in this game, and honestly, he's kind of been better in this series up until this point. Like, if you're just looking at individual, like, in-lane performances, I think Tong Yuan has definitely held his own. He hasn't exactly been perfect, but Game 1, Game 3, like, I think both of those games were very positive for him overall, and I think there's definitely some good takeaways from that, but a really good Jace game. Wei was really good on the Maokai. Didn't need to do nearly as much damage in this game, but still did build full AP Maokai, obviously a build that he likes to go, and, you know, with the lack of AP damage outside of that on this team, maybe with the exception of Varus, I can definitely understand why you would want to go that, and so Top side of the map continuing to be positive for them. Bot lane still having some question marks. Not that they were bad in this game, because they didn't make any sort of major errors. One death combined among the both of them. I'm not super impressed by their ability to take over games. It doesn't really feel like LP is winning a lot of games for RNG. And in a meta where there are a lot of really good AD carries and there are a lot of good, marksman players that are kind of dominating the meta right now and just kind of winning games for their teams, it feels like LP is just not a part of that. He's a good player. He's certainly not a great player. He might not even be considered a good player. I think he's an okay player. He's someone who you can win with, but you're probably not going to win a lot of games because of LP, and I think that's starting to get exposed in this playoff series, but I'm being a little bit too critical, I think, of him here. Lele was good, certainly better than anything Lumao had done up until this point in the series, so I would expect them to continue to play him at least for the rest of this series, and, we'll see what happens, if they end up making it past this, but just a good game for RNG. They absolutely needed it. Of course, their season would have been over with a loss, and so a win here keeps them alive. Their job is not done, but it's certainly a step in the right direction. And then for NIP on the other side, you don't really want to lose a game in the playoffs, but if you are going to lose a game, losing game 3 up 2-0 is usually a relatively good place to lose a game, and they did just kind of get outplayed in this one. This was kind of a stomp, probably the least close game of anything we've seen in the series up until this point, but that's what happens when your Rel gets out-jungled in the early game. Like, genuinely, that's just kind of how that ends up working out. I think that Shadow, realistically, very well could get dud of the game here, but I'm going to give it to Angel in the mid lane on this Tristana. It felt like he lost pressure so early on in this laning phase to the Jace, which is just never going to be a good sign as Tristana, who really does, excel in the early game, so to have her struggle at that part of the game so much, I think, was definitely a problem. And then, obviously, we talked about, Invincible not necessarily having such a good game, really being kind of taken out of the fight by the Cassante and really not allowing a lot to happen. Shadow wasn't particularly good, especially in the early game. This is the problem with Rel. If she falls behind, even for a little bit, she's kind of useless. Like, she really doesn't do all that much in the jungle to create, because you don't really want to skirmish with her if you're playing from behind, but she doesn't really do anything else. And so, kind of a risky pick, and it was definitely punished a bit more this game. The Ziggs, I think, is a really interesting idea. I really think AP bot laners are underutilized at the current moment outside of Kai'Sa. I think people really aren't picking them up. I mean, Varus obviously kind of has a little bit of that in his kit, but Ziggs I think is something that I would expect to see a little bit more out of. Maybe not this playoffs because people don't like to adapt to change, but I personally would be prioritizing Ziggs a little bit more than maybe some of the other AD carries that are being prioritized over him, like the Ashe, and so I like the pick. I just don't think it worked out. And then Alistar was relatively... Yuzhua was fine on the Alistar. Some engages were good, some were bad. It really wasn't a bot lane problem in this game for NIP. It was jungle mid kind of losing, and that's a little bit frustrating. But again, it's game number 3 in a series that you were up 2-0. And so you're allowed to lose this as long as you're able to bounce back. Now, saying that, you certainly don't want to also lose game 4, because then you're going into a do or die game number 5, having lost 2 games in a row, which is certainly not the position you want to be in for your confidence, for your mental. NIP wants to be able to close this out at the very least in game number 4. I think they do have the tools to do it, but they've got to put in a better performance than what they had in game 3. And, the substitution definitely helped RNG. Maybe they're reinvigorated with Lele coming in. Maybe they feel like they can take this. If they can win that game number 4 and push this to a Silver Scrapes game number 5, this could very well be a very interesting series because they, like I said, would have all the momentum on their side, and they definitely have the talent to be able to win an individual game. So this game 4 is actually very important for both teams, but who's going to be able to take it? Well, we're going to find out right now because the winner of game number 4 was Ninjas in Pyjamas. They are able to take game number 4, and that means this series has come to a close. They end up taking them down in 4, 3-1. Oh my god, NIP won a playoff series. If we said that in spring, would anybody have believed us? Maybe, because this team always had potential, but man, they were really bad in spring. They were the second worst team in the LPL in spring, and here they are now beating RNG in a playoff series to knock them out of Worlds contention. Incredible stuff from NIP, incredible stuff from these players, and it really is the players that you wanted to see step up most. We know that Shadow and Angel can really be big positive influences for this team, but Invincible, Photic, those are the two that we really needed to see be the guys, and you know what? They were in this game number 4. Player of the game is going to go to Invincible in the top lane on that Rumble. It was finally let through in one of the games today, and it really showed why it's been kind of permabanned across the entire day up until this point, because Rumble is in a state right now where I think he's just going to beat every other top laner in the meta. it very much feels like Rumble, Ivern, Tristana, Jace. Like, those are all just, like, crazy power picks in the meta at the current moment, and Casante's obviously still really good, but those are the 4, well, I guess 5, because you have to add in Kai'Sa as well, but those are the 5 that I would consider to be, like, super meta-defining. I know everybody likes LeBlanc, but I still think the AD mid laners are a little bit better at the current moment, and Rumble shows why he's, like, pick or ban at the current moment in this top lane matchup. Invincible looked really, really good. This is a player that I've liked for quite a while. I think his individual talent is pretty astounding. He's a phenomenal laner. Like, he's someone who can just dominate lane phase against almost anybody in the world, and that's really been his big strength, and I think that's what NIP has seen in him that they really want to continue to move on with. But the question has always been, can he transition those early leads that he's able to generate into pressure around the map, or is he just going to be kind of a guy that wins lane and then doesn't really do a whole ton after that? That's kind of the concern when it comes to Invincible. Well, he did a lot in this game. He certainly transitioned that lead. Really good performance from him. If he can step up and be one of the more interesting top laners, which he absolutely has the skill to be, then I think NIP is going to be even more dangerous moving forward in the playoffs. But great performance from him. Photic was fantastic on the Xayah as well. He's actually going to get my player of the series, and man, am I happy to give Photic a player of the series in the playoffs, because the playoffs have been a little bit of a rough stretch for Photic over the course of the beginning part of his career, and I know that, you know, I'm a little bit harder on him than I am on some other players, but that's because I do think public perception is just a little bit swayed on him in comparison to the players that I do think he's a little bit more comparable to. But, you know, he can have performances like this. He's better than LP, and he absolutely should be better than LP. He came into the year as, you know, most people's a top 5 bot laner for most people. I think he was number 6 for me, somewhere close to that, and even I was low on him, and he was top 6 for me, and in the LPL, that's pretty damn good, and so he should be able to take care of a weak bot lane, and bot lane really was the strength for NIP throughout this whole series. Just, they won every single game, they were better every single game, and it was very impressive stuff. Photic looking really, really good, and if he's going to be able to keep that up, consistently be able to deal the most damage in the game throughout the playoffs, like, who knows how far this team can go. We know how good Photic can be. It's just about him being that good, actually, when we get down to it. But Shadow was also really good across this whole series. If he had a better game number 3 and a better game number 4, he probably would have been player of the series, because games 1 and 2 were kind of run by Shadow and really were super impressive performances, and he was definitely in consideration even with games 3 and 4 for player of the series. But I think the Rel was just a little bit too aggro at points in this game for me to give it to him, and then obviously Photic was just spectacular throughout this entire game, and so he deserves it. But, you know, Shadow still was really good, and I still think he's the heart and soul of this NIP team. I still think he's the best player that this team has, and he's really what they like to play through, and he was the better jungler in this series, and that's impressive. Angel finally had a really good game this series on the Ahri, even if he wasn't the focal point. He was probably the most forgettable member of the entire team across this whole series, and that's a good thing, like I said, because Angel is a very good player, and I have faith that he's going to be able to step up if they need him to. And then Zhuo was fine. I think this was probably his weakest game of the series. The Nautilus really didn't do all that much. The Xayah was more so set up by the Rel and the Rumble than she was the Nautilus, but still, I mean, Zhuo's on a playoff winning team. That's pretty darn good. And so, NIP moving on to the next round. It's going to be a really interesting matchup. I'm excited to preview that. But RNG on the other side, their season is over. And you've got to be disappointed, because RNG, I think, had expectations of being a team that at the very least competed to go to Worlds, and they're not even going to be remotely in that conversation. They're barely a top 10 team. They're going to finish 9th, 10th in the summer split, which is just not very good, and they deserve it. They are a 9th, 10th team in the LPL at the current moment. Dead of the game for me in Game 4 is pretty obviously going to go to Tong Yuan. Like a miraculously disastrous Nico play towards the back half of the game that I think a lot of people are going to remember him for. Like, that's like a career-defining play in a bad way for Tong Yuan. And it's unfortunate, to say the least, because I thought he was good across most of this series, but this game number 4 was pretty bad. But it wasn't just him. Like, LP did a lot of damage in this game 3 on the Zeri, but Zeri plus Engager, not really what you want to see. I don't think that combo is particularly good, and even though the Zeri was able to do a lot in this game, it wasn't exactly effective damage, and Lele was significantly worse in game number 4 than he was in game number 3. Basically no good Leona engages across this entire game. But look at the rest of this team. Of course there were no good Leona engages. You have to go in with the Nocturne, and there's really no easy way to go in with Nocturne if you don't have backline access. And so, very difficult for the Leona to actually create plays. I really hate that draft decision. I know that Lele's, you know, a big Leona player. He was that in the past as well when he's had some time, you know, for FPX in the LPL, but no, I don't think it's very good with this draft, and I think Zeri definitely struggled because of it as well. But, you know, Breathe, Wei, they tried. They were okay this series. I think Wei definitely got out-jungled in game number 4 here. He got out-jungled in probably half the games this series, which is relatively fine. But Breathe, I still think, is a really good player. He had another really good Cassante game, in my opinion. Just a lot of setups, but only so much you can do. But their season is now over. That's it for RNG. They're done. They're going to be moving into, you know, moving into next year and trying to figure out what they need to do, which players they want to keep, which young players they want to try to build around. It's definitely going to be an interesting conversation because I think their young players have shown some interesting things, but I do also think that they are holding them back from being a team that maybe wants to reach the heights and the expectations that this organization might have at the current moment. So they've got a lot of planning to do in the offseason, but Ninjas in Pyjamas are going to be moving on, and you know, with that, it's time to get into previewing the round 2 matchups. There are a lot of interesting things to talk about, and congratulations to NIP for moving on. All right, but that is going to do it for my LPL Summer Playoffs Round 1 overview and analysis. Up on the screen, you're going to see the updated LPL bracket after the first round of games, and we get 2 teams moving on. EDG is moving on to face OMG, and NIP is moving on to face Weibo. Really excited to preview this series, but WE and RNG are officially eliminated, not only from the playoffs, but from World's contention, because they just don't have enough championship points to be able to qualify for the top 6, which is obviously very unfortunate, but let's go ahead and get into previewing the matchup, starting, of course, with EDG versus OMG. Already previewed this in my primer. Again, check out the iCard if you want to go check out that video. I go pretty in-depth on why I think this matchup is really interesting, but I think this really could go either way. This is a coin flip for me. I think in that video, I ended up picking EDG. I think that they had a little bit more firepower to what they're doing, but I think the Ale-Shanji matchup in the top lane in particular is going to be incredibly influential towards what happens in this game. I think Ale is really starting to come on right at the right time, and Shanji is the player that OMG kind of drives through, and so going to be very interesting to see that. But I'm picking EDG. I could see OMG winning in like a 3-0 sweep. Like, there absolutely is a world where OMG ends up winning this, but my prediction would be Edward Gaming letting the talent get through. And then on the other side, Weibo Gaming versus Ninjas in Pyjamas. This should not be a close series. Weibo should be the better team here by a considerable margin, but, you know, they're so inconsistent. They're born to win trade. Is there a universe where I could see, you know, Weibo just not showing up and Shadow and Angel and Photic and Invincible having a really good series and being able to carry them to another series win, maybe a close one? Yeah, I could absolutely see that being a possibility. I think if the Shy has a really bad series, which is definitely possible, Weibo could go out early. Same thing for Weiwei, same thing for Xiaohu, and so a lot of really intriguing matchups here for NIP. I think Shadow into Weiwei is probably going to be the matchup that I'm watching the most, because I do think if that like heavily swings in favor of NIP, that's their opportunity, that's their chance to be able to win, and I do like Shadow a bit more than I like Weiwei at the current moment, but Weibo's bot lane should be able to just kind of steamroll over NIP's, if I'm being entirely honest, in terms of summer performance, so I'm still going to take Weibo, but NIP could definitely win it. But I want to know you guys' thoughts down in the comment section below. Who do you think is going to be winning the 2 series? What did you think of the 2 round 1 series? Would love to know you guys' thoughts and feedback. Of course, if you enjoyed the video, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it helps get this video out to a lot more people. Of course, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button. We post about not only the LPL playoffs, but all 4 of the major regions, as well as the NACL, and playoffs are starting everywhere. We're still covering some of the regular seasons, but playoffs are going to be kicking into high gear, and so if you want to get some good insight as to how some of these potential Worlds teams are doing before that big tournament starts, hit the subscribe button and hit that bell so you can be notified when all of those videos go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.